I thought my grandfather's lake cabin was the safest place left in my life. Then, an HOA president named Marjorie Blake showed up with an eviction notice. She said my family's cabin was built on land that belonged to her community. The same dock where I learned to fish was suddenly marked for seizure. I had 30 days to leave or lose everything my family had protected for generations. Subscribe, because what happened next changed Pine Lake forever. The first thing I saw was not the sheriff's badge. It was the red paper nailed crooked into the old cedar door of my grandfather's cabin, snapping in the lake wind like a warning flag. Behind it, 3 black SUVs idled in my gravel drive, their headlights cutting through the pale autumn fog, while every bird on Pine Lake went silent. I stood barefoot on the porch with a coffee mug in my hand, wearing the same flannel shirt I had slept in, watching a woman in a white tailored suit step out of the lead SUV as if she owned the ground beneath her heels. The morning sun had not fully cleared the pine trees yet, but she looked untouched by the cold, silver hair pinned perfectly, leather gloves tight around a folder thick with legal papers. A uniformed county deputy stood beside her, eyes lowered, one hand resting near his belt, looking like he wished he'd been sent anywhere else. My name is Nathan Cole. I am 56 years old, a retired marine engineer, and for the last 2 years, Pine Lake had been the only place quiet enough for me to breathe. My wife, Laura, died on a rainy Tuesday in a hospital room in Grand Rapids, and after that, the cabin became less of a house and more of a life raft. I fixed the roof myself, kept her blue coffee cup by the sink, and watched the morning mist rise off the water because some days that was the only thing that kept me from breaking open. The woman in white walked up my porch steps without asking. Her heels clicked against the wood my grandfather had laid with his own hands after coming home from the war. She stopped inches from me, close enough that I could smell sharp perfume over wet leaves and lake mud. Her face carried no anger, no pity, no hesitation. Only the calm smile of someone who had already decided how my story was supposed to end. She introduced herself as Marjorie Blake, president of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. The deputy handed me the papers before I could say a word. The top page said, "Notice to vacate. 30 days. My own name printed in cold black ink. My address, my cabin, my dock, my shoreline. According to the documents, I was occupying community land illegally, and Silver Pines had the legal right to reclaim the property under an old reversion clause I had never heard of in my life. For a moment, all I could hear was the lake knocking against the wooden posts below the dock. I looked past Marjorie at the cabin windows, at the reflection of the red eviction notice trembling in the glass, and I thought about my grandfather carrying lumber through snow to build this place in 1948. I thought about my father teaching me to tie knots on that dock. I thought about Laura sitting under the porch light, wrapped in a blanket, telling me Pine Lake was the only place where time seemed kind. Then I looked back at Marjorie and realized she was not there to negotiate. She had come to take. She told me the cabin sat inside the historic boundary of Silver Pines, even though that subdivision had not existed when my family first set foot on this shore. She said the HOA board had reviewed the matter carefully. She said the community had tolerated the error long enough. She said if I refused to leave, they would move forward with seizure, block my road access, remove my boat from the dock, and cut off my lake rights before winter. Her voice never rose. That was what made it worse. She spoke about erasing 75 years of my family's life, the way someone might discuss changing a mailbox color. Across the road, curtains shifted in 2 lake houses. A man walking his dog stopped at the bend and quickly turned around. Farther down, near the old boathouse, Walter Reed stood half-hidden beneath a red maple, his thin body wrapped in a brown coat, his gray beard moving slightly in the wind. Walter had lived on Pine Lake longer than anyone still alive, and he was not the kind of man who frightened easily. But that morning, his face had gone pale. When our eyes met, he gave the smallest shake of his head, not as a warning to stay calm, but as if he already knew this was bigger than one cabin. I asked Marjorie how a homeowners association could claim land that had belonged to my family before Silver Pines was even drawn on a map. She smiled then, slowly, like I had stepped into the exact trap she wanted. She opened her folder and showed me a glossy survey stamped with seals, signatures, and dates. The lines on the page curled around my cabin, my dock, my tool shed, even the patch of grass where Laura had planted lavender the spring before she died. Everything I loved had been reduced to shaded territory inside a fake-looking border. My hands tightened around the eviction notice until the paper bent. I had spent 30 years reading ship schematics, pressure diagrams, and mechanical failure reports. I knew when something looked official because it was true, and when something looked official because someone wanted you too scared to question it. The map in Marjorie's hands was too clean, too new, too perfect. And the longer I stared at it, the more I felt that cold engineer's instinct waking up inside me, the one that used to whisper before a steel hull cracked or a pressure valve blew. My phone buzzed on the porch rail. Emily, my daughter. I had called her twice before dawn after seeing the SUVs coming up the road. She was an attorney in Chicago now, sharp, busy, distant in the way children become when grief leaves too much unsaid between them and their parents. When I answered, her voice was clipped and tired, already bracing for another problem she thought I had made worse by being stubborn. I told her the HOA was trying to take the cabin. There was a pause long enough for the lake wind to fill it. Then she told me not to fight people with lawyers unless I had proof. Proof. That word stayed with me after she hung up. Marjorie watched my face as if she could hear the disappointment bleeding through the phone. Then she gave me one final look at the cabin, like a buyer inspecting a property she had already stolen in her mind, and turned back toward her SUV. The deputy muttered that he was sorry, but he did not meet my eyes. The vehicles rolled out one by one, crushing pine needles into the gravel, leaving the red notice on my door and exhaust hanging in the cold air. I stood there until the sound of their engines disappeared behind the trees. Then Walter Reed crossed the road slowly, every step careful, his eyes moving from the notice to the lake to the tire tracks in my drive. He did not come onto the porch. He stayed at the bottom step, as if even the boards beneath my feet had become dangerous. His voice was low when he finally spoke. Marjorie Blake was not after my cabin alone. She wanted the whole lake. And before I could ask what he meant, Walter slipped a folded newspaper clipping into my hand, yellowed with age, soft at the edges, and stained with something that looked too much like old smoke. The headline was from 1972. One name jumped off the page and hit me harder than the eviction notice ever could. My grandfather's. The newspaper clipping felt warm in my hand, even though the morning air had turned sharp enough to bite. Walter Reed stood below my porch with his collar pulled up, refusing to look toward the lake road, as if Marjorie's black SUVs might come rolling back through the fog at any second. The headline was faded, but my grandfather's name was clear. Elias Cole testifies in Pine Lake land dispute. I read the words twice, and still felt like I was staring at someone else's family. My grandfather had never mentioned a court fight. My father had never mentioned Blackwater development. All I knew was the version told at Thanksgiving tables and funeral receptions, that Elias Cole came home from the war, bought a wooded strip of lakefront, and built a cabin with borrowed tools and hands that never stopped shaking when thunder rolled in. But there, in yellowed print, was a picture of him outside the county courthouse, jaw clenched, hat in hand, standing beside 3 other lake families who looked like they had just walked out of a storm. Walter finally told me the name nobody around Pine Lake liked to say anymore: Blackwater Development. In the late 60s, they had tried to turn the entire shoreline into a private resort town, pushing out old cabin owners with lawsuits, missing records, and surveys that changed every time money changed hands. Walter's voice lowered when he said the courthouse basement burned the year after the case ended. Land ledgers, deed books, survey files, all gone in one night of smoke and broken glass. And then, almost too quietly, he added that Marjorie Blake's family name had not always been Blake. I drove into town before the frost melted from the windshield. The county records office sat behind the courthouse like an afterthought. Brick walls stained dark from decades of weather, narrow windows catching weak strips of sun. Caleb Foster met me on the steps wearing a brown wool coat and carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than his law degree. He was not the kind of attorney who filled a room with confidence. He was thin, tired-eyed, and kept his tie slightly crooked. But he had represented dock owners, farmers, and one stubborn bait shop owner long enough to know when legal paper smelled rotten. Inside, the records room felt like an old church built for forgotten arguments. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Dust floated through the air in thin silver lines. Caleb spread Marjorie's glossy HOA survey across a metal table, while the clerk pulled the original plat books from 1952, their covers cracked and taped together like wounded animals. When the old map opened, the paper made a dry sound that raised the hair on my arms. The lines did not match, not a little. Not in a way a lawyer could explain away with new measurements or shoreline erosion. The 1952 plat showed my grandfather's cabin outside every planned development boundary, sitting cleanly on private lakefront land. The HOA survey Marjorie had handed me wrapped silver pines around the cabin, like someone had drawn a noose after the fact. Caleb leaned closer, the color draining from his face, and traced both maps with one finger. He did not speak for almost a full minute. That silence told me more than any legal opinion could. Then he noticed the coordinates. On Marjorie's so-called historic map, tiny GPS reference points were printed along the shoreline grid, neat and modern, the kind of detail most people would glance over because it looked technical and official. But I had spent my career reading navigation systems and marine positioning data. Those numbers did not belong on a document pretending to come from the early 70s. They belonged to a world of satellites, digital surveys, and software that had not existed when my grandfather was still splitting firewood behind the cabin. Caleb took pictures of everything, his hands moving faster now. The clerk watched us from behind the counter, lips pressed tight, the way people look when they know more than they are allowed to say. When Caleb asked about Blackwater Development's original filings, she disappeared into the archive hall and came back with nothing but a gray index card. The file box had been listed as destroyed in the courthouse fire. No copies, no backup, no attached deed records. Just a burn notation stamped years ago, flat and final. That should have been the end of it, but grief teaches you to search strange places. That evening, back at the cabin, I went down into the basement with a flashlight and a crowbar, following a memory I had not touched since childhood. My grandfather used to keep coffee cans full of screws behind the old furnace, and below them was a narrow wooden cabinet built into the wall. The air smelled like damp stone, rust, and cedar shavings. Rain tapped against the high basement window, while the lake wind pressed low and steady against the cabin. Behind a stack of warped storm shutters, I found a tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were fishing licenses, war ration cards, brittle photographs, and a black notebook tied shut with twine. My grandfather's handwriting filled the pages in hard, slanted strokes, angry in some places, shaky in others. He had written dates, names, meetings, threats. He wrote about survey stakes appearing overnight. He wrote about men from Blackwater Development offering cash to widows and disabled veterans. He wrote about a woman named Evelyn Blackwater, who promised the lake would belong to her family before she died. I sat on the basement floor until my knees went numb, reading under the flashlight beam while dust clung to my sleeves. On the last page, my grandfather had underlined one sentence so hard, the pen had nearly torn through the paper. They will come back under another name. My phone rang so suddenly I almost dropped the notebook. Emily's name glowed on the cracked screen. This time, her voice did not carry that distant city impatience. It was lower, sharper, frightened in a way she tried to hide. She had checked the Michigan Business Registry from her office in Chicago. Silver Pines Homeowners Association, the organization trying to evict me from my own cabin, had no proper state registration, no valid corporate standing, and no clean paper trail for the authority Marjorie claimed. My daughter, who had told me not to fight without proof, had found the first crack in Marjorie's armor. Before I could answer, headlights swept across the basement window. They cut through the rain in two white blades, then vanished. Gravel shifted outside. Not the soft crunch of a neighbor pulling into the drive, but the slow, careful weight of someone trying not to be heard. I killed the flashlight and held my breath. Upstairs, the old floorboards creaked once near the back door. I looked down at my grandfather's notebook, still open in my lap, and saw one more name written in the margin beside Blackwater Development. Blake. The back door did not burst open. It moved slowly, one careful inch at a time, like whoever stood outside already knew the cabin was supposed to be empty. I stayed frozen at the bottom of the basement stairs, with my grandfather's notebook pressed against my chest, listening to rain drip from the eaves and a stranger's boots test the kitchen floor above me. For 10 seconds, I was not a retired marine engineer or a grieving widower or a man fighting an HOA. I was a boy again, hiding under a dock during a thunderstorm, while my grandfather told me that fear only wins when it gets you to move before you think. So I didn't move. I waited in the dark until the footsteps crossed the kitchen, stopped near the old desk by the window, and then retreated so quietly the house seemed ashamed of making noise at all. By the time I reached the porch, the driveway was empty except for rainwater shaking in the tire tracks. Nothing had been stolen, not the silver on the shelf, not the fishing rods, not Laura's blue coffee cup by the sink. But the drawer where I kept my property tax receipts had been opened, and the framed photograph of my grandfather beside the dock had been turned face down. Whoever came into my home was not looking for money. They were looking for history. The next morning, I drove the shoreline road under a sky the color of wet steel, stopping at every cabin where curtains moved when my truck passed. Pine Lake had always been a place where people waved from porches and left spare keys under flower pots. Now doors opened only halfway. Voices dropped when I said Marjorie Blake's name. A man with sawdust in his beard told me his annual HOA fees had tripled after he refused to sign an easement. A widow near the South Cove showed me a stack of threatening letters tied with yarn, each one warning that legal action would ruin her if she fought the board. One by one, the lake I thought I knew began to reveal bruises under its sweater. The worst was the Harper cabin. George and Ruth Harper had owned the green cottage near the Willow Bend for 41 years. I remembered George teaching kids how to skip stones from the public landing, Ruth bringing pies to every 4th of July cookout, both of them smiling in that gentle way older couples do when they have spent a lifetime forgiving each other for small things. Now they lived in a rented apartment above a hardware store in town, with half their furniture in storage and a framed photo of the lake sitting on a folding table like a gravestone. Ruth's hands trembled when she poured coffee. George would not sit down. He stood by the window with his jaw working, staring at a parking lot instead of water. Marjorie's people had buried them in legal notices, emergency assessments, fines for dock violations, and claims that their deed contained defects no one had mentioned in 4 decades. The numbers climbed until their savings disappeared. Then Marjorie offered to buy the cabin for less than half its value, calling it a compassionate settlement. Ruth cried when she admitted they took it, because George's heart medication cost more than pride could afford. That was the moment I wanted viewers to comment if they had ever seen someone powerful crush decent people with paperwork and a smile. Because sitting across from the Harpers, watching an old man blink back rage he was too tired to use, I understood Marjorie's real weapon was not law. It was exhaustion. Emily called while I was parked outside Claire Donovan's cafe, the windshield streaked with rain, and the Harper story still burning in my throat. This time, my daughter did not sound distant. She sounded awake. She'd spent the night digging through state records, bank filings, property transfers, and community notices from Silver Pines. The HOA was not just improperly registered. It functioned like a private machine built around Marjorie Blake, collecting monthly fees through accounts tied to shell vendors, charging residents for maintenance that never happened, and using those funds to pressure lakefront owners into selling cheap. Emily's voice cracked halfway through the explanation, and for the first time since Laura's funeral, she stopped speaking like an attorney and sounded like my daughter again. She said she was sorry, not for the case, not for the documents, for leaving me alone with the cabin, with Laura's empty chair, with the silence she had mistaken for stubbornness. I sat there gripping the phone while rain hammered the truck roof, unable to answer, because grief has a cruel way of making love feel like blame. I wanted to tell her I had been angry too. I wanted to tell her every unanswered call after her mother died felt like another room going dark in the house. Instead, I watched Claire through the cafe window as she wiped down tables under warm yellow lights. Her dark hair pinned loosely, her sleeves rolled up, moving with the steady grace of someone who kept serving people, even when her own world was on fire. Claire hated Marjorie more openly than anyone on Pine Lake. Her cafe had become the only place residents whispered the truth, and that made her dangerous. When I stepped inside, she slid a mug of coffee toward me before I asked. There were tired shadows beneath her eyes. That morning, 2 inspectors had walked in during breakfast rush, checking permits, fire exits, grease traps, food labels, and even the angle of the sign above her door. They found nothing, but one of them left a warning about future compliance reviews. Claire did not say Marjorie sent them. She did not have to. Her smile was brave, but the way she kept glancing toward the front window told me fear had already found a seat in the room. That night, I stopped waiting for proof to land in my lap. I mounted trail cameras in the pines around the cabin, one near the driveway, one facing the dock, one hidden inside a hollow birdhouse pointed toward the north property line. The work felt familiar, like checking a ship before a storm, tightening every bolt because you knew the waves were coming, whether you respected them or not. I placed my grandfather's notebook in a locked metal case beneath the floorboards, and left one harmless folder of old tax copies visible on the desk, bait for anyone bold enough to come back. At 2:17 in the morning, my phone lit up beside my bed. Motion detected. The screen showed 3 figures moving through my trees under a thin moon, their faces hidden by hoods, their flashlights covered with red film. They carried survey stakes, a mallet, and a rolled sheet of paper in a plastic tube. I watched them kneel beside my lavender patch, the one Laura planted before her heart gave out, and drive a bright orange stake into the frozen ground as if marking a grave. Then one of them looked straight toward the birdhouse camera, and for one sharp second, the red light caught the silver HOA emblem on his jacket. I was still watching the footage when another alert came in from the dock camera. A 4th person stood at the water's edge, perfectly still beneath a black umbrella. White suit, leather gloves. Marjorie Blake did not touch a single stake. She simply watched her men rewrite my property line in the dark, then turned toward my cabin window as if she knew I was awake. By sunrise, the fake stakes formed a crooked border around everything my family had left me. And taped to the last one was a fresh notice, sealed in plastic against the rain. Final warning before seizure. By noon, the orange stakes were gone, but the holes they left behind looked like bullet wounds in the frozen ground. I pulled each one out with my bare hands, while the wind came hard off Pine Lake, and when I reached Laura's lavender patch, I found the soil split open around the roots, like someone had tried to mark her memory for demolition. That was the first time I stopped feeling scared of Marjorie Blake, and started feeling something colder. I carried the final warning notice inside and laid it on the kitchen table beside my grandfather's notebook. the trail camera footage, and the old newspaper clipping. The cabin felt different now. Every creak in the walls sounded like a secret shifting behind the wood. Every shadow beneath the furniture looked too deliberate. I had spent 2 years walking these rooms like a widower, touching Laura's chair, keeping the windows clean, listening to the lake, because silence was easier than people. But that morning the cabin stopped feeling like a tomb. It felt like a witness. Emily drove in from Chicago before sunset. I saw her headlights sweep through the pines, then watched her step out in a dark coat, hair pulled tight, carrying a laptop bag and the kind of tired expression lawyers wear when the truth is worse than they expected. For a second, I saw Laura in the angle of her face, in the way she paused at the porch, like crossing that threshold meant admitting how long she had stayed away. She did not hug me at first. She looked at the red notice taped to the door, at the camera still mounted above the porch, at the lake behind me fading into gray, and the distance between us seemed to shrink under the weight of everything Marjorie had dragged into our lives. We spent the evening at the kitchen table, the one my father sanded down the summer I turned 12. Caleb Foster arrived with courthouse copies. Claire came by after closing the cafe, bringing soup nobody remembered to eat. Walter Reed stood near the wood stove with both hands wrapped around his cane, eyes fixed on the floorboards like they were accusing him. Outside, the lake disappeared into darkness. Inside, 4 people and 1 old man's notebook tried to rebuild a history someone had worked very hard to bury. Emily had found the money trail first. Silver Pine's fees had been moving through maintenance vendors that existed only on paper, then disappearing into private accounts linked to Marjorie and 2 shell companies registered in the Caribbean. The amounts were not small. Dock repairs that never happened, snow removal billed twice, legal defense funds moved the same day residents paid them. Claire went pale when Emily mentioned the cafe inspections, because one of the shell companies had paid the consulting firm that filed complaints against her business. Marjorie was not just trying to steal land. She was punishing anyone who gave me shelter. That was when Walter finally broke. He lowered himself into the chair across from me, and the old wood groaned beneath him. His face looked smaller in the lamplight, the lines deeper, the guilt older than the man himself. He told us he had worked in county planning in 1972, back when Blackwater Development tried to swallow Pine Lake. He was young then, newly married, afraid of losing his job, afraid of men who came into the records office wearing expensive coats and speaking softly about consequences. After the court ruled against Blackwater, certain files were supposed to be copied and sealed. Before that could happen, the courthouse basement burned. Walter had seen 2 boxes carried out the night before the fire, boxes with Pine Lake written on the side. He knew. He stayed quiet. And for 50 years, silence had sat beside him at every meal. No one spoke for a long time. Claire looked at him with anger and pity fighting behind her eyes. Emily's jaw tightened the way mine does when I'm trying not to say something cruel. I wanted to hate Walter in that moment. I wanted to put all the missing records, all the fear in the Harper's apartment, all the orange stakes in Laura's flowers onto his bent shoulders. But he looked so destroyed by his own confession that hatred had nowhere clean to land. He reached into his coat and placed an old brass key on the table. It had belonged to my grandfather, he said. Elias had given it to him before the trial ended, telling him that if the papers vanished, the lake would still have one last memory hidden where family would know to look. The key had a tag tied to it with a piece of darkened string. No address, no label, just 3 scratched letters. B.S.F. At first, none of us understood. Then Claire looked toward the front room, where the old stone fireplace sat beneath the mounted ship's wheel my grandfather had salvaged from a wrecked ferry. Blackstone fireplace. That was what my father used to call it, because the stones had been hauled from the North Ridge in a wheelbarrow before the road was paved. My heart began to pound in a way that had nothing to do with fear. We moved the rug first, then the ironwood basket. The hearthstones were cold beneath my palms, uneven and stained by decades of ash. Caleb found the seam with a pocket knife, a hairline cut almost invisible under soot. The brass key fit into a round plug hidden behind a loose stone on the left side. When I turned it, something clicked deep beneath the floor with a heavy metallic sound that made everyone stop breathing. A square section of floorboard behind the fireplace lifted half an inch. Inside was a steel safe. It took all of us to drag it out. The metal was black with age, heavy as grief, and wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived moisture, mice, and time. My grandfather's initials were scratched into the lid. E.C. My hands shook when I opened it, not because I was afraid of what might be inside, but because for the first time in days, I felt him in the room with me. Not as a portrait or a story, as a man who had known the future would come wearing another name. The safe held everything Marjorie never expected to exist. The original lakefront map, hand-signed and sealed. A copy of the 1972 court judgment confirming every old Pine Lake cabin as independently owned land beyond the reach of any private development authority. Letters from Blackwater attorneys threatening my grandfather. Photographs of survey stakes being planted in the dark half a century before Marjorie's men did the same thing. And beneath all of it, wrapped in blue cloth, was a will. My grandfather's secret will. Emily read it aloud with tears forming before she reached the second page. Elias Cole had not left the cabin as just a piece of property. He had placed it in a family trust with one purpose: to protect Pine Lake shoreline families from any future development scheme claiming false community authority. If Blackwater or any successor tried again, the Cole heir had legal standing to represent not only the cabin, but the independent owners around the lake. My grandfather had turned our little wooden house into a shield and never told us. Maybe because he hoped the day would never come when we had to use it. Claire touched my hand under the table, not dramatically, not like a movie romance. Just a warm, steady pressure that told me I was not standing alone in a room full of ghosts anymore. Emily folded the will carefully, and when she looked at me, there was no doubt left in her face, only sorrow, pride, and the fierce focus of a daughter who had finally come home to fight beside her father. Then Caleb's phone buzzed. He stepped onto the porch to answer it, and through the window I saw his shoulders stiffen. When he came back in, his face had gone gray. Marjorie had filed an emergency motion that afternoon accusing me of fabricating evidence, harassing HOA contractors, and tampering with disputed property markers. A judge had granted a temporary order freezing access to my dock, my driveway easement, and the shoreline until a hearing. But that was not the worst part. Caleb placed his phone on the table and played the voicemail Marjorie's attorney had just received from the county clerk's office. Someone had already entered a new document into the land record system, dated 2 weeks earlier, claiming the Cole family trust had been dissolved years ago. I looked down at my grandfather's real will, still warm from Emily's hands, and for the first time, I understood Marjorie was not just fighting us with lies. She had someone inside the courthouse helping her rewrite the truth. The annual HOA meeting did not feel like a meeting. It felt like a public execution, dressed in folding chairs and coffee urns. By the time I walked into the Silver Pines clubhouse, every conversation died at once, and more than 100 faces turned toward me, like I was either the villain they had been warned about, or the last man willing to say what everyone else was afraid to whisper. Marjorie Blake stood at the front of the room beneath a chandelier too fancy for a building with water stains on the ceiling. She wore navy instead of white that night, pearls tight around her throat, silver hair swept back so sharply it seemed painful. Behind her, a projection screen displayed 3 words in clean black letters: Emergency Property Enforcement. On the table beside her sat a stack of packets thick enough to ruin a family. My name was on the first page. I came in with Emily on my right, Caleb on my left, Walter behind us, and Claire slipping quietly along the wall with her phone held low against her coat. She had not told me she was going live until we reached the parking lot. Her cafe had been harassed, her business threatened, her windows watched at night. And still she looked at me with that steady fire in her eyes and said people needed to see what Marjorie did when she thought she owned the room. By the time I reached the center aisle, the live stream counter was already climbing. Marjorie did not blink when she saw us. That was her talent. She could look at a man whose life she had tried to erase and make him feel like he had interrupted her dinner. She began by thanking residents for attending during what she called a serious threat to community safety. Then she spoke about rising legal costs, emergency lakefront enforcement, disputed properties, and the need to raise monthly assessments before winter. Each phrase was polished smooth enough to hide the blade inside it. Around the room, people shifted in their seats, scared, angry, confused, tired of paying fees they never understood. Then she put my cabin on the screen. A drone photo of it appeared in harsh overhead light. My grandfather's roof, Laura's lavender patch, my dock stretching into gray water. Red lines boxed the property in like evidence at a crime scene. Marjorie told them my cabin had always belonged inside Silver Pines territory. She told them I had refused lawful correction. She told them the board would vote that night to authorize seizure, removal of unauthorized structures, and denial of all lake access until compliance was complete. She never said my wife's flowers would be torn out. She never said my family photographs would be packed by strangers. Legal language did the cruelty for her. I felt Emily's hand brush mine under the folder she carried. For years, that hand had belonged to a daughter I thought grief had taken from me too. Now it was steady, warm, and ready for war. Caleb asked to address the board, and Marjorie refused before he finished standing. Her smile widened as she announced that no outside counsel could speak for a non-member trespasser. The room murmured. Someone near the back said that was wrong. Someone else told them to sit down. The air tightened. That was when a woman from the board rose slowly from the table beside Marjorie. Her name was Linda Carver, Silver Pines volunteer accountant, a small woman with nervous hands and glasses she kept pushing up her nose. I had seen her earlier in the parking lot with Emily, crying beside a blue sedan, holding a cardboard file box against her chest like it contained a bomb. Marjorie turned toward her with a look that could freeze blood. Linda did not look back. She faced the residents and placed the box on the table. The sound of that box hitting wood changed the room. Inside were bank statements, vendor invoices, transfer records, and handwritten notes Linda had copied for 3 years because she was afraid one day Marjorie would make her disappear too. Emily stepped forward then, not as my distant daughter, but as an attorney with steel in her spine. She showed the first transfer on the screen. HOA fees paid by residents. Money routed to a dock maintenance company that had no employees, no equipment, and no address beyond a rented mailbox. Then another. Snow removal paid during a month with no snow. Legal defense money transferred into an account tied to Marjorie's private trust. The silence became something physical, pressing against every wall. Marjorie tried to stop it. She called the documents stolen. She called Linda unstable. She called Emily an out-of-state lawyer interfering with local governance. But Emily clicked to the next slide, and there it was. The state registry page showing Silver Pines HOA had never been validly incorporated, never properly renewed, and never held the authority Marjorie had claimed for years. A fake crown, a fake throne, a fake kingdom built from real people's money. I saw Mr. Harper in the second row, his knuckles white around Ruth's hand. I saw young parents whispering numbers into their phones, calculating how many months they had paid for services that never existed. I saw a man in a work jacket stand up and ask where the playground fund had gone. A woman shouted about road repairs her husband had done himself. Someone else yelled that Marjorie had forced his mother to sell her cabin after threatening a lawsuit. The room began to turn, not in chaos, but in recognition. That was the moment everyone realized they had not been unlucky. They had been hunted. Caleb gave me the nod. I walked to the front with my grandfather's will inside a sealed evidence sleeve. My legs felt heavy, but not weak. I placed the original 1972 judgment on the table, then the lakefront map, then the secret will that named the Cole Family Trust as protector of the independent shoreline owners. The projector cast my grandfather's signature across the wall, enormous and unshaking. I told them the court had already ruled 50 years ago that no private development could claim Pine Lake's original cabins. I told them those records had vanished in a courthouse fire. I told them Marjorie had tried to make them vanish again. Then Claire's live stream caught the side doors opening. First came 2 state police officers, then 3 federal agents in dark jackets, moving with the calm speed of people who had waited long enough. The room fell silent so fast I could hear Marjorie inhale. For the first time since she walked onto my porch, her face changed. Not fear exactly. Calculation. Her eyes searched for exits, allies, control. She found none. An agent stepped forward and read her name. Marjorie Blake stood perfectly still as the charges filled the clubhouse like thunder rolling over the lake. Wire fraud, money laundering, falsified land records, extortion, conspiracy, obstruction. Linda began sobbing quietly. Ruth Harper covered her mouth. Claire's live stream numbers exploded on the screen of her phone. Thousands of strangers watching a woman who had ruled Pine Lake by fear finally meet a power she could not invoice, threaten, or charm. When the cuffs closed around Marjorie's wrists, no one clapped at first. The sound was too intimate, too final. She looked at me as they turned her toward the aisle, and I saw hatred there, clean and sharp. But beneath it, something smaller. Disbelief. She had truly believed people like me would break before people like her ever had to answer. As the agents led her past, she leaned close enough that only I could hear her. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, and colder than the lake in January. She said I had no idea who else wanted that shoreline. Then she was gone, dragged through the clubhouse doors into the flash of cameras, while every resident of Silver Pines turned back toward the screen where my grandfather's will still glowed on the wall. And in the lower corner of the document, beneath the signature I knew, I noticed a second name I had somehow missed. Witnessed by Evelyn Blackwater. The first snow fell on the morning Marjorie Blake was sentenced. It came down soft and silent over Pine Lake, covering the docks, the pines, the courthouse steps, and the black news vans parked outside, like the whole county had been waiting for winter to bury what she had done. I sat in the back row with Emily on one side and Claire on the other, watching the woman who once stood on my porch like a queen now sit in a plain gray suit with no pearls, no white gloves, no army of lawyers strong enough to save her from the truth. Marjorie did not look at the residents when the judge read the sentence. 24 years in federal prison, asset forfeiture, restitution to every family she had bled dry, and a permanent ban from managing any association, trust, or property fund again. The courtroom stayed quiet, but not because people were satisfied. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm when survivors are still checking what parts of their lives are standing. George Harper held Ruth's hand in the front row. Linda Carver cried without hiding her face. Walter Reed stared at the floor, as if every year of his silence had finally been spoken aloud by someone else. When the marshals led Marjorie away, she passed within 10 feet of me. For a second, I thought she would give me one last threat, one last cold little smile to prove she still had power over the room. But she looked smaller than I remembered. Not harmless, never harmless. Just finally seen. And maybe that was the punishment she hated most. Not the prison years or the seized accounts, but the fact that every person she had fooled now knew exactly what she was. The months after that did not feel like victory at first. They felt like cleanup. Federal agents froze her bank accounts, sold her lake house, her cars, her jewelry, and the office building she had bought through one of her shell companies. Checks started arriving to families who had stopped believing anyone would ever repay them. Some cried at their mailboxes. Some stood in the grocery store comparing restitution amounts with trembling hands. The Harpers got enough back to buy a small cottage near the public landing. Not the old green one they lost, but close enough to see the same sunset. George told me he could live with that, and the way Ruth touched the window when they moved in told me he was not the only one trying to forgive time. My name was cleared in every court record Marjorie had tried to stain. The emergency orders vanished. The fake claims against the Cole Trust were struck down. The county opened an investigation into corrupted filings, and 3 officials retired before anyone could ask them too many questions under oath. My grandfather's will was recorded properly at last, sealed not in a basement or safe, but in the public archive, where no fire, no hidden hand, and no polished liar could erase it again. The cabin took longer to heal than the paperwork. Winter cracked 2 porch boards. The roof needed patching. The dock had warped where Marjorie's contractors had tried to block access with chains. Emily came up from Chicago every other weekend at first, wearing boots too clean for lake mud and pretending not to be afraid of power tools. By spring, she had stopped pretending. She sanded railings, carried lumber, argued with contractors, and opened a small law office in town with a sign that read Cole Legal Aid, Property Rights, and HOA Abuse. The first day, there was a line outside before she unlocked the door. Claire reopened her cafe with new windows, fresh paint, and a little wooden dock behind it where kayaks could tie off in summer. Somewhere between rebuilding the porch and drinking coffee after closing time, we stopped pretending our hands touched by accident. Love at my age does not arrive like lightning. It comes quietly, carrying groceries, remembering how you take your coffee, sitting beside you when the lake gets too dark and memory gets too loud. Claire never tried to replace Laura. That was why there was room in my heart to let her stay. Silver Pines dissolved the old HOA in a packed meeting that lasted 3 hours and ended with people laughing for the first time in a year. In its place, residents formed a transparent lake association with public budgets, elected officers, term limits, outside audits, and one simple rule written at the top of the bylaws. No community has the right to become a kingdom. Nobody asked me to be president. I would have said no anyway. But they did ask me to chair the Shoreline Protection Committee, and when I looked around at the Harpers, Claire, Walter, Emily, and all those families who had once avoided eye contact out of fear, I said yes. 1 year after the eviction notice was nailed to my door, I stood on the rebuilt dock at sunset with my grandfather's final letter in my hand. Emily had found it tucked inside the safe lining, behind a piece of loose felt we had somehow missed. The paper smelled faintly of oilcloth and cedar. His handwriting was weaker than in the notebook, but the words still stood straight. He wrote that land was never just dirt, timber, water, or deed lines. It was where children learned courage, where women planted flowers after funerals, where old men left warnings for people they would never meet. It was memory made visible. The last line nearly broke me. He wrote that if the lake ever became quiet again, I should not spend my life guarding it like a wounded soldier. I should live there. Fully, loudly, with doors open, porch lights on, and people I loved close enough to hear the water with me. I folded the letter and looked back at the cabin. Emily was on the porch, laughing at something Claire said. Walter sat near the fire pit, wrapped in a blanket. Older and frailer now, but finally lighter. The Harpers were walking slowly along the shoreline, hand in hand, their footprints filling with gold from the sinking sun. Laura's lavender had survived the winter. New green stems pushed through the soil where Marjorie's men had driven their stakes. For the first time in years, I did not feel like I was preserving a life that had already ended. I felt like I was standing inside one that had somehow begun again. Pine Lake moved gently beneath the dock, dark blue and silver, carrying the last light across the water. I whispered goodbye to my grandfather, then to Laura, not as a man trapped in grief, but as a man finally brave enough to keep living. And when Claire came down the dock and slipped her hand into mine, I looked at the cabin, the lake, my daughter, my neighbors, and the place Marjorie Blake had tried to steal. For the first time in a long time, it did not feel like property. It felt like home. The lesson of this story is simple. Sometimes the things people try to take from us are not just property, money, or comfort. They are memories, dignity, and the quiet places that remind us who we are. In everyday life, not every battle will be as dramatic as a fight over a lake cabin. But we all face moments when we must stand up for the truth, protect the people we love, and refuse to let fear make our decisions. Justice may take time, but honesty, courage, and family can still bring light back into the darkest places. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell us what you would have done in Nathan Cole's place. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. May God bless you and your family, protect your home, and guide you with peace, strength, and courage every day.